Well, hey, Bible Love listeners, so glad you are back with us in our very special series, Women in Ministry. Before we get started today and I introduce you to our lovely, wonderful guest, I want to continue with our prayer attributed to St. Francis. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Amen.
So today we have my friend, the Reverend Peggy Muncie, with us. Peggy is a retired clergy member in the Diocese of Upper South Carolina with me, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know her. Peggy, I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mary Balfour.
Of course, I really wanted to have Peggy here because one day I went to have lunch at her wonderful home with her husband, Stephen. And Peggy and I started talking about her ministry and some of the things that she's gotten to experience, lots of joys and some heartaches. And I was just so intrigued by her story. And I also was so grateful for all that Peggy did to pave the way for women in ministry. And so I just asked Peggy to come and share some of that with us today. So here we are. I'm so glad you're doing that.
Well, thank you.
So Peggy, let's start. Maybe not at the beginning, maybe in the middle somewhere. And tell me about your call to ministry and what that looks like.
It came sort of when you said that prayer, out of despair, there's hope. That's a way to start.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was in my freshman year of college, my father died when I had been there 6 weeks.
Oh, bless you.
It was a pretty awful experience because everybody else was, playing around, having a good time, and I was not in that place. I had a very difficult first 2 years at college, and I was poor, pitiful Pearl to myself. And I was very close to the curate of our church, who had been incredibly helpful to my mom, who was a very young widow at 46. Mm-hmm. Donald suggested that maybe we should spend some time apart because things were getting a little testy. I mean, 20-year-old women and their mothers often get testy anyway, but this was exacerbated by my grief and her grief, which were going on. And I said, well, I'm not going to go study somewhere, and I'm not going to go backpack through Europe. So, what's the plan? Well, the plan turned out to be a program called the Clayton and Wynett Volunteers, which started in 1948 when John Wynett asked some students and seminarians to come work in the war zone in England. And the program had continued. So this was 1968. The program was 20 years old. And I had no idea I would be accepted. And I was.
Wow.
And I was given an assignment in South Mead Youth Center in Bristol, England. And it was still pretty war-torn. A lot of rubble. If kids knew who both parents were, that was an oddity. Mm-hmm. Good level of poverty. So I worked in a youth center that was opened when the hours of the pub were open, giving people something else to do, an alternative experience. And I realized that I was able to communicate with these kids. I was able to talk with them. I was able to bring experiences that we shared together with them. And it was all very wonderful. And I began to think about that. And when I came back to college, I began to reflect on that in a lot of ways. One being that the only course I'd really excelled in my sophomore year was Christian theology. And because it was a UCC college. And then I thought, well, if I can communicate, what's the most important thing that's ever been communicated to me? And that is when you don't think anybody else loves you, the love of God in Jesus Christ is there for you. So if I was going to use the gift that I was beginning to think I had, the gift to communicate with people, then that was the most important thing that I felt I could ever communicate. So I ruminated on that and I changed my major to religion and sociology. So I worked a lot with people in field ed. And I really enjoyed the study of religion. I became a good student from a bad student. And one night in 1970, early in the year, I walked over to the chapel when the light was on in a professor's office. And I said, how does one go to seminary? And Dr. Boston said, we've been wondering when you were going to ask.
But Peggy, I love that response. But also, it was 1970. You had not ever seen a female priest in 1970. I mean, no. That is very brave to ask that question. How does one go to seminary?
You know, I've always been one to push limits. You know, I sailed a sailboat until you learn to push against the wind. Yeah. And I figured I could go to the university. Well, I applied to the University of Chicago and Hartford, both which were interdenominational seminaries, and I was accepted. I was also pretty social activist oriented. And so the University of Chicago under Jesse Jackson and the plunge experience that he had there would have been interesting. But then I got cold feet and said, if I'm going to do this, and there are very few women thinking about this even now, I better go where nobody can question what seminary I went to and the theology behind it that I learned. So
you were an Episcopalian, so you felt like I need to go to an Episcopal seminary, right?
Absolutely right. So I deferred the acceptance for a year and I worked as a juvenile probation officer, which was even more instilling to say, I don't belong as a juvenile probation officer. I belong in the church. I belong as a person who shares the gospel.
You got to have those experiences sometimes to kind of figure that out, right? Where you belong.
Oh, absolutely. And so General Convention met in October of 1970 and passed the canon for deacon's ordination. And 3 weeks later, I was in Bishop Sherman's office with the curate of my church saying, I'd like to go to seminary. And
what diocese was this?
Chicago? This was the Diocese of Long Island. It was a very conservative, tried, true Anglo-Catholic diocese. And Bishop Sherman was a very traditional man. I won't say he was conservative. I'll say he was traditional. You know, he was a Connecticut Yankee. He'd gone to Yale. He had gone to general seminary. He had been a fellow and a tutor at general, and he'd been on the board at general. So he said, well, where do you want to go to seminary? Because he had a very deep voice. And I said, well, I think I need to go to seminary, A, to an Episcopal seminary, and B, to a seminary where I'm going to have support of people I know, meaning my family, meaning this guy I met on an airplane, meaning my friends who are working in New York. And I said, well, I want to go to general. And he said, well,
it's his seminary too.
Yeah, he said, well,
he got a little plug there too.
He was all on board for general. Yeah. No problem. All on board. So he said, well, the most important thing he said is, I have never turned anyone down who wants to test their call, but I mean test their call.
Yeah.
So you have to go through the process. Back in those days, there was not the kind of discernment process there is today.
Right.
But there were panels and psychiatrists and all that kind of stuff. Plus, you have to be accepted to seminary.
Right. Well, let me stop you there, Peggy, because to me, and I've told you this before, but to me, to even test those waters, as Bishop Sherman said, knowing the answer would be, sure, you might be, sure, you can go to seminary, sure, you might, do ministry, but we have never ordained a woman before. Like, that is so brave. I mean, I don't know if I could do that.
It was a cross between bravery and naivete.
Okay.
It was a cross between that. And it was part of just believing in myself that was where I needed to be.
And that God had put that on your heart too. I mean, clear.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if back then I would have used those words. That was far more theological than I was when I went to seminary. Mm-hmm. But I knew I had to try. And, I often tell this story to people, at seminary was a very, it was like a metronome. There was a certain rhythm to the day when I was there.
Right. I remember that.
It was a real rhythm, morning prayer, Eucharist at noon, except on Tuesdays when it was community Eucharist, evening prayer at 5:30, and the bells rang the day. Some days I literally, I couldn't bring the body to the morning prayer or the evening prayer. And I had a room that was kind of funny. We used to call it the half-ass room because I was the first student there. So they put me in what had been a former married student's room, and it had a bedroom, a beautiful living room and sitting room, and then this combination bathroom and kitchen. I mean, it was weird. And I used to sit on the old New York City radiator and look down the close. I could see all the way down the close, and I could see the chapel, and I'd sit there, and almost it was like being in prayer. And I'd say, if I'm supposed to be here, keep me here. But if I'm not, you got to give me the sign. Just give me the sign, God, and then I'll know. But the sign never came. And more signs to encourage me to stay remained. Now, it wasn't easy. The faculty, for the most part, were super supportive.
That's great.
Some of the students weren't.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other women there with you?
The second semester, Paige Bigelow came over. She had done a year at Drew in New Jersey.
So the first semester, you were the only female in your class.
Yeah.
Let's just pause at that for a minute. That is very intimidating. Again, brave of you. I'm so thankful that you said yes to that.
It was like, okay, you're with people and, just, there were guys, the girls, some of the wives were around. I mean, there were other women. The faculty wives were very supportive and
Not
nice.
sitting in the classroom with you.
Sitting in the classroom, I was pretty much alone. And I remember I guess I told you this, but the first exam that I took in the Blue Book was Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
And Boyce Bennett was the professor. And, everybody's nervous to take their first seminary exam. You remember that.
Yeah.
And we take it. And then, 2 classes later, you get the Blue Book back, but you can't bear to open it. So you would go back to your room and you open it. And I kind of went, oh my God. And it was, I got a really good grade. And it said, excellent understanding of covenant.
Oh, wow.
And, I said, okay, we're in for this one,
Some confidence. Yep. Yeah. For sure. Okay. So you go through seminary, then what happens?
Oh, I had a very good 1974.
Yes.
I graduated from seminary on May 15th. Paige and I graduated together. There were about 30 of us in the class. No, there were 18, 30 some odd started, 18 graduated. And the professors came around and presented Paige and I champagne on a silver tray that we could toast that right at the front of the seminary. June 15th, I was ordained in the chapel, in the Cathedral of the Incarnation in Garden City with Bishop Sherman, did the ordination. 2 of my classmates from General were ordained with me, Bruce Chilton and Bob Odierna, and a guy who was a vocational deacon for my parish, Dan Harris. So it was a lovely ordination. And then on July 27th, I married the Reverend Stephen Bowley in the chapel at General Seminary. And
that's a big year.
I started my job at Vassar as Episcopal chaplain to Vassar on August 28th.
Now, in all that though, Peggy, you were ordained a deacon, but you still did not know if you were be ordained a priest at that time, right? Because that had not happened yet.
It had not happened because the General Convention of 1973 said no to the priesthood canon. I mean, I remember being in Louisville. I remember Sam Wiley, who was the dean of the seminary at that point, coming out with this look on his face and hugging 3 of us who were there saying, no, you must wait. And I had promised Bishop Sherman I would wait, that obedience would be what I would pledge to him. So I'd only been ordained a deacon a month and 2 days when the ordination of the women in Philadelphia, the 11 extra-canonical ordination happened. And I literally could not be there because I was sitting on a plane getting ready to go to Ireland on my honeymoon.
Your honeymoon, yes.
And
how long were you a deacon?
I was a deacon for 3 years. I was ordained, they passed.
Peggy, we should tell people the typical when you are a transitional deacon, and what I experienced was 6 months.
That's right. It had always been 6 months.
A transitional deacon, and then 6 months later, you're ordained a priest. So Peggy had to wait 3 years to be ordained a priest.
Yeah, and even couple of months longer, because I would have been ordained in January of 1977 when it was first legal. The first woman ordained to the Episcopal priesthood canonically, legally, under the canon laws of the church, was ordained at midnight in Indianapolis. Her name was Doris Moat. And then there were a whole string of them after that. And I went to 21 ordinations to the But
Wow.
everybody kept saying, who's the short, fat deacon? Well, the short, fat deacon was 8 months pregnant.
I was about to say, you were not fat. You were having children.
That's right. My first daughter was born on Ash Wednesday, 1977. And
Mm-hmm.
I came home, and I had lived and worked in New York for 2 years, 2.5. And the Diocese of Long Island, which was my canonical diocese, would not let my papers, the bishop had changed, and the bishop would not receive papers for ordination to the priesthood.
Mm.
However, the suffragan bishop of New York had gone out to Harold, right, had gone out to Long Island because he had been out there and worked out there, and asked on behalf of Bishop Paul Moore to have my papers brought to the Diocese of New York. So literally, they were driven across the Triborough Bridge. Bishop Moore received my papers, and I'd been home from the hospital with Victoria for 2 days. And the phone call came. Hi, congratulations on the baby. What did you call it? Victoria. Oh, you had a girl. Great. When would you like to be ordained? So just no questions, like pick your date. And I said, April 25th, St. Mark's Day. I've had to roar like a lion for all these years, so I think it's kind of appropriate. Oh, great, fine. Where would you like to be ordained? The chapel at Vassar College with my kids. Terrific. Would you like me to ask Bishop Sherman to ordain you? Oh, yes.
Love it. And so that happened in 1977.
April 25th, 1977. My
So
kids.
I know how many years that is because it was a few months before I was born. You have been a priest as long as I've been alive, and I love that. I love that. Love that. Okay, the time goes so fast, so I just want to ask you a couple of quick more questions. So, not only are you a priest, you finally get ordained. You were so brave and did all this. You are married to an Episcopal priest, and in the midst of this, you have 2 children. That's a lot. How did you and Stephen kind of do all this in a short answer, if possible? With both your ministries and raise your children.
The short answer was we decided we would never minister in the same place at the same time. And 2 parish churches would be divisive for us.
Right.
God gave me a path in the fact that I had started a calling ministry at a hospital back before HIPAA, when you could do that. And I visited Episcopalians in the region, and I loved it. And so I decided to go ahead. I'd already had 2 units of CPE from seminary, and I took the rest of them and became board certified. So I became a board certified chaplain, and a chaplaincy ministry allowed me to put limits on my day, to bracket my day. That was one of the first things. The second was I knew I needed help. Good help. It was before the days of daycare. I had a really good person to take care of Victoria. 8 years later, when I had Caroline, I literally got an au pair to be at home and help me. So help became essential. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say that it was that we didn't have, like, why the heck aren't you home for dinner? Or can't you do more of this? But you
made it work, which a lot of people that I know that are both ministers, both spouses are ministers. It's very difficult, but I love that very early on you found your calling, as a chaplain, as a priest. You still got to do sacramental things when you supplied or when you were doing whatever you were doing.
Well, in the hospital.
Right.
And the nursing home, because I worked my longest, all my ministries have been 9.5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Segments.
Yeah.
And I worked as director for spiritual services for Episcopal retirement homes. So I had an Episcopal sacramental ministry in that home.
Yeah. And so I love that you were able to find that balance. And now you and Stephen are kind of retired. I mean, one of the ways that I got to know you all is Stephen was the interim at Church of the Resurrection where I serve, and Peggy and Stephen have shown up and loved me endlessly. And they also often supply for me so that I can take a break. And so you're still getting to do this ministry, even though you have retired from Canterbury Counseling, even though Stephen is retired, you'll always be priest, right? And that's exciting.
You never give it up. And one of the things I do that's kind of exciting right now is I have a consultancy ministry with healthcare chaplaincy, and the cutting edge ministry is telechaplaincy.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
In home care. And so I supervise telechaplains in 2 home care agencies.
That's awesome. And you're a grandmother.
And Bradley Alexander, I was just his birthday party.
Yes, you're getting to do all these things, which I love. Still very involved with General Seminary in New York. I know that y'all are a part of that. And I'm just always, every time I see you, I'm so grateful and thankful that God called you and that you said yes. Even in a time when you weren't sure if it would all happen,
There's something about the blindness of hope. That if you really know and feel that you need to do something, that you need to move in that direction, even though you're walking through the dark, you're going to get that little guidance.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for being you. I love you very much. And I'm so grateful for this time with you. Listeners, remember, as always, that we love you, but most importantly, God does.